The 1994 marriage between Aaliyah and R. Kelly remains one of the most controversial stories in music industry history, involving allegations of an inappropriate relationship, falsified documents, and widespread industry controversy. Working within the isolated environment of a recording studio, the 27-year-old producer was later accused of exerting significant influence over the young singer during the creation of her early career. Some critics and observers later viewed the album as reflecting the troubling dynamics surrounding that period of her life. Kelly was also accused of using falsified state documents in connection with the marriage. Because he generated substantial revenue, parts of the music industry were later criticized for minimizing damaging allegations and failing to adequately support the young artist involved. The sharp contrast between the glamorous public image and the private controversy continues to shape discussions surrounding Aaliyah Houghton's legacy. In the summer of 1994, the global music industry was entirely captivated by a phenomenon. A 15-year-old girl from Detroit, possessing a voice of striking, ethereal clarity and a smile that radiated absolute innocence, had dominated the Billboard charts. Her debut album, Age Ain't Nothing But a Number, was not just a commercial success, it was a cultural monolith. It sold millions of copies, achieved multi-platinum status, and instantly established Aaliyah as the definitive trend-setting face of a new generation of R&B. The public saw a self-assured, effortlessly cool teenager performing on MTV, draped in oversized street apparel, projecting an aura of untouchable confidence. They saw a musical triumph. They saw a prodigy realizing her ultimate dream. The objective, unvarnished truth is entirely different. When you strip away the platinum plaques, the heavily curated magazine covers, and the relentless radio rotation, the narrative of a young girl achieving pop superstardom begins to unravel. Age Ain't Nothing But a Number was never viewed by critics as simply a work of art. Many later saw it as a carefully controlled project shaped by deeply troubling power dynamics behind the scenes. It became a highly profitable controversy operating in plain sight. The album reflected the influence of an adult man exerting overwhelming control over a teenage performer, using her extraordinary vocal talent to promote material that would later spark intense public scrutiny. A closer examination of her ambitious career trajectory helps explain how a 14-year-old girl became caught in a relationship and industry environment that many observers later described as manipulative and exploitative. Shattering any illusion of a manufactured industry plant, she operated strictly as a legitimate, generational vocal prodigy. Born in Brooklyn and raised in Detroit, she possessed an innate, sophisticated musicality that far exceeded her chronological age. By the age of 10, she was competing on national television programs like Star Search. By 11, she was performing on stage alongside legendary vocalists like Gladys Knight in Las Vegas. She harbored a fierce, legitimate drive to succeed. She possessed the raw material of a superstar. However, in the entertainment industry, the immense ambition of a child prodigy is frequently their greatest vulnerability. A child's desperate desire to realize their dream can be easily weaponized by the adults who hold the keys to the recording studio. The fatal intersection of Aaliyah's ambition and her ultimate destruction was facilitated by the very structure designed to protect her family. Her uncle, Barry Hankerson, was a prominent, highly connected music executive. Hankerson was the manager of the most successful, lucrative R&B artist and producer of the decade, Robert Sylvester Kelly. Hankerson recognized the undeniable raw talent in his young niece, and he made the fateful decision to connect her with his primary client. He brought a 12-year-old girl into the direct, unshielded orbit of a 24-year-old megastar. In the pursuit of a record deal, the familial safety net was entirely bypassed, placing a vulnerable child directly into the hands of a man whose coercive operator appetites were already an open secret within the dark corridors of the Chicago music scene. When Aaliyah entered the Chicago Recording Company studios in late 1992 and early 1993 to begin work on her debut album, she was 13, turning 14. R. Kelly was 25, turning 26. The power dynamic in that room was absolute and entirely asymmetric. Kelly was not simply hired to provide a few instrumental tracks. He was the executive producer, the sole songwriter, and the absolute dictator of the creative process. He possessed total control over the budget, the studio time, and the eventual release of the music. For a young teenager entering her first professional recording environment, the producer is viewed as an omnipotent figure. He is the authority, the mentor, and the gatekeeper to her future. What transpires when the most powerful producer in the music industry decides to weaponize that authority? He does not simply control the vocal arrangements, he initiates a complete systematic hijacking of the artist's psychological reality. R. Kelly did not look through the glass of the vocal booth and see a student to be nurtured. He saw raw, highly valuable material to be molded, consumed, and bent entirely to his will. Abandoning any attempt to capture her authentic voice, he weaponized the recording process explicitly to overwrite her identity with his own. The creation of the album functioned as the perfect, insulated environment for severe psychological conditioning. A recording studio operates outside the bounds of normal societal time. Sessions last for 12, 14, sometimes 18 hours, stretching deep into the night. It is a closed ecosystem, heavily soundproofed and locked away from the scrutiny of the outside world. Within this vacuum, Kelly began to systematically dismantle the boundaries of a 14-year-old child. He controlled her schedule, her vocal inflections, and her daily interactions. He isolated her from her peers, replacing a normal adolescent existence with a grueling, highly pressurized work environment where his approval was the only metric of success or failure. A psychological prison is infinitely more effective than a physical one because the victim is actively manipulated into building the walls themselves. Kelly presented his total suffocating control as artistic dedication and mentorship. He convinced a young, ambitious girl that his extreme demands, his constant presence, and his aggressive intrusion into her personal space were necessary components of the star-making process. He twisted the natural trust a child places in a teacher into a binding mechanism of compliance. Aaliyah was isolated, heavily monitored, and relentlessly pressured to perform. Her dream of becoming a singer was held entirely hostage by a man who demanded total subjugation in return for chart success. The profound tragedy of Aaliyah's early career lies in the violent theft of her childhood. The public saw a mature, enigmatic starlet, completely unaware that this maturity was an artificial construct forced upon her by a coercive operator. The fragile beauty of her actual youth, her genuine personality, and her authentic adolescence were actively suppressed. She was required to project the image of a seasoned, worldly woman while biologically and emotionally possessing the vulnerability of a middle school student. Every smile for the camera, every promotional interview, and every live performance was executed under the heavy, invisible shadow of her abuser. She was a child navigating a multi-million-dollar corporate machinery while simultaneously managing the volatile, dangerous demands of a 26-year-old man who viewed her as his personal property. The album that launched her career into the stratosphere was simultaneously the anchor that dragged her into an unimaginable nightmare. The millions of records sold did not represent her artistic liberation. They were the heavily marketed, highly profitable documentation of a child being slowly and methodically consumed by the very industry that promised to make her a star. The music industry of the early 1990s operated under a rigid, heavily patriarchal hierarchy, where absolute power was concentrated in the hands of the male superproducer. During this era, the technological shift in R&B and pop music moved away from traditional live bands and towards digitally synthesized tracks. This technological shift fundamentally altered the power dynamic of music creation. The producer was no longer just an engineer sitting behind a mixing board. He was the sole architect of the sound. Men like R. Kelly owned the recording equipment, programmed the drum machines, wrote the lyrics, and held the exclusive publishing rights. Young vocalists, particularly teenage girls entering the industry, were treated by this system as highly replaceable raw vocal instruments. They possessed no financial capital, no industry connections, and absolutely no creative leverage. The producer held the keys to their entire future, creating a deeply asymmetric relationship that the industry actively encouraged and celebrated. This power imbalance was publicly romanticized through the producer and protege narrative. The media and the recording labels frequently praised older male producers for discovering, molding, and polishing young female talent. This cultural normalization provided a flawless, socially acceptable camouflage for predatory behavior. When a 26-year-old man demanded total uncompromising control over a 14-year-old girl's schedule, wardrobe, and vocal delivery, it was not flagged by the industry as a dangerous grooming tactic. It was applauded as artistic dedication. The system inherently validated the dominance of the adult male while demanding absolute, unquestioning submission from the minor. Aaliyah stepped directly into this structural trap, a trap perfectly calibrated to isolate her and empower her abuser. That environment was the physical recording studio, a space that served as the ultimate coercive operator fortress. The architecture and the operational schedule of a 1990s analog recording studio were perfectly designed to facilitate extreme psychological manipulation. These facilities were heavily soundproofed, entirely windowless, and secured by massive, heavy acoustic doors. Once inside, the artist was completely severed from the external world. Furthermore, this was an era before ubiquitous cellular communication. The only connection to the outside world was a studio landline, which was strictly monitored and controlled by the producer. Kelly utilized this isolated physical geography to sever Aaliyah's connection to normal societal rhythms. He dictated that their recording sessions would take place in the dead of night, frequently stretching from midnight until dawn. This nocturnal schedule was not a quirk of the creative process. It was a deliberate tactic of exhaustion and control. By forcing a teenager to operate entirely outside of daylight hours, he severed her from the grounding routines of a normal adolescence. She was removed from a standard school schedule, from family dinners, and from the protective observation of ordinary society. The exhaustion depleted her cognitive defenses, making her infinitely more susceptible to his psychological conditioning. Inside the specific confines of the vocal booth, the power dynamic was distilled to its most terrifying, clinical extreme. Aaliyah was placed inside a small soundproof glass box. She wore heavy headphones that isolated her from her own natural environment. The only voice she could hear was R. Kelly's, feeding directly into her ears from the control room. Through the mechanics of the studio talkback microphone, Kelly possessed total sensory dominance. He could hear her every breath, but she could only hear him when he chose to press a button and speak. He controlled the volume, the tone, and the pace of the entire interaction. He used this absolute sensory control to meticulously break down her boundaries. He would force her to sing the same suggestive, age-inappropriate lyrics dozens of times until she was physically and emotionally exhausted, breaking her will until she delivered the exact vocal inflection he demanded. The vocal booth was not a place of artistic expression. It was an interrogation room where an exploiter systematically rewrote the internal reality of his victim. He utilized the multi-million-dollar infrastructure provided by Jive Records to ensure that when Aaliyah was inside that studio, the only God, the only authority, and the only reality that existed was Robert Sylvester Kelly. The infiltration of a child's psychology does not begin with an overt display of violence. It begins with the strategic deployment of trust. Robert Sylvester Kelly did not approach Aaliyah as the exploiter. He entered her life utilizing the ultimate Trojan horse of the entertainment industry, the title of the visionary mentor. For a 14-year-old girl stepping onto the terrifying high-stakes chessboard of the global music business, a mentor represents safety. A mentor provides a roadmap, decodes the complex machinery of the industry, and offers the promise of actualizing a lifelong dream. Kelly aggressively occupied this role, demanding absolute deference not just as a producer, but as an omniscient guide. He weaponized the traditional respected dynamic between a teacher and a student, twisting her natural adolescent desire to learn and succeed into a mechanism for total subjugation. Grooming is a highly systematic process of boundary eradication. It requires the abuser to systematically dismantle the victim's internal alarm systems until the abnormal becomes the daily baseline. Kelly executed this by intentionally collapsing the walls that separate professional instruction from intimate personal control. The recording studio was merely the staging ground. The coercive control rapidly bled out into every microscopic detail of Aaliyah's daily existence. He began to dictate the fundamental biological rhythms of her life. He controlled her sleep schedule, deciding when she was allowed to rest and when she was required to be awake and available to him. He managed her dietary intake and strictly heavily monitored her interactions with anyone outside of his immediate approved circle. By micromanaging her basic human needs, he intentionally induced a state of deep cognitive regression. Aaliyah was an incredibly intelligent, capable 14-year-old, but by seizing control of her most basic daily choices, Kelly reduced her to a state of infant-like dependency. This is the hallmark of extreme psychological abuse. When a victim is no longer allowed to decide when they sleep or what they say, their independent identity begins to fracture. They lose trust in their own instincts. Kelly replaced her internal compass with his own voice, ensuring that she could no longer navigate reality without his explicit direction. He became the sole arbiter of what was right, what was wrong, what was acceptable, and what was forbidden, This extreme level of isolation and control was masterfully disguised as profound artistica. Kelly convinced a developing teenager that his suffocating grip was actually a shield against a cruel and coercive operator industry. He fed her the narrative that he was the only person who truly understood her, the only one who could protect her immense talent from being exploited by the greedy executives. He manufactured a deeply twisted us versus the world paradigm. By positioning himself as her savior, he successfully masked the terrifying reality that he was the absolute greatest threat to her survival. He forced a child to view her captivity as a sanctuary, conditioning her to feel gratitude for the very chains he was wrapping around her. She was manipulated into believing that true artistic dedication required the complete surrender of her physical and emotional autonomy. The most visible, iconic manifestation of this psychological captivity was broadcast directly to millions of fans through her wardrobe. Aaliyah's physical presentation in the mid-1990s fundamentally altered the landscape of fashion. She stepped onto the global stage, draped in heavily oversized baggy denim, enormous athletic jackets, and sports jerseys that swallowed her slight frame entirely. She paired this uniform with a bandana and dark, heavy sunglasses that consistently shielded the upper half of her face. The media, the fashion magazines, and the consumer base enthusiastically embraced this. They praised her for popularizing a revolutionary urban tomboy aesthetic. They celebrated her for rejecting the hypersexualized, skin-bearing trends typical of female R&B artists of the era. The public narrative hailed her clothing as a bold statement of feminist independence and youthful rebellion. When analyzed through the clinical, objective lens of criminal pathology, this wardrobe was the exact opposite of independence. It was the visual architecture of her imprisonment. The oversized clothing served two distinct, highly calculated, coercive operator functions. First, it was a vital tool for optical camouflage. Aaliyah was a child navigating a highly publicized adult world. Her biological reality, her slight, developing 14-year-old body, was a massive legal and public relations liability for a 26-year-old man constantly standing by her side. By forcing her into clothing that completely obscured her physical silhouette, Kelly effectively erased the visual markers of her youth. The baggy clothes hid the child. They allowed the public to project a false maturity onto her, making the visual pairing of the producer and his protege significantly less jarring and less suspicious to the casual observer. He utilized fashion to hide the crime scene in plain sight. Second, the wardrobe functioned as an aggressive form of territorial marking. Coercive operators are inherently possessive, driven by a deep pathological paranoia regarding their victims. Kelly demanded that Aaliyah obscure her body specifically to remove her from the gaze of other men. He was establishing a visual perimeter. Rather than a mere fashion choice, the oversized jackets and baggy jeans functioned strictly as a physical barrier dictated by a jealous abuser. He was communicating a silent, terrifying message to the rest of the world. Her physical form was not for public consumption because her body was his exclusive private property. He stripped her of the right to define her own physical presentation, forcing her to wear a daily uniform that constantly reinforced his ownership. The heavy, dark sunglasses she consistently wore completed this cycle of sensory isolation. The eyes are the primary vehicle for human connection, empathy, and nonverbal communication. When a victim is trapped in a coercive environment, Their eyes frequently betray the terror they are verbally forbidden to express. By forcing her to hide her eyes behind black lenses, Kelly effectively blinded her connection to the outside world. He severed her ability to make genuine eye contact with the public, with interviewers, and with anyone who might recognize the profound distress of a child trapped in a nightmare. The sunglasses acted as a physical wall, keeping the world out and keeping her locked entirely inside the psychological cage he had built for her. The public cheered for a fashion icon, completely oblivious to the fact that they were applauding the dress code of a hostage. The very title of Aaliyah's debut album remains one of the most chilling, audacious artifacts in the history of recorded music. Age Ain't Nothing But a Number was marketed aggressively to the consumer public as a harmless, soulful declaration of universal love, a catchy, empowering slogan for teenage rebellion. In reality, it was a highly calculated, broadcasted alibi. When a 27-year-old man forces a 15-year-old girl to stand in front of a studio microphone and declare to the world that her chronological age is entirely irrelevant, he is not simply writing a pop song. He is actively drafting a legal defense for unlawful interaction with a minor and setting it to a heavy, infectious 1990s R&B beat. Robert Sylvester Kelly utilized the album title as a direct psychological weapon designed to proactively neutralize public suspicion. He understood the dark mechanics of pop culture. If he could condition the global audience to sing along to the exact justification of his crimes, he could hide his deviance in plain sight. It was a staggering act of sociopathic arrogance. He was effectively daring the world, the media, and the legal system to look directly at the undeniable evidence of his abuse and dance to it. The lyrical content of the album has often been described by critics as a disturbing example of psychological influence and emotional manipulation. Every song on the record was written by Kelly. According to later analysis, Aaliyah's authentic teenage perspective was largely absent, replaced instead with themes and viewpoints shaped by an adult male producer. A young performer, still in her early teens, was directed to deliver vocal performances centered on mature relationship themes and emotionally complex material far beyond her age. Songs that dominated the radio were later criticized for appearing to normalize an unhealthy power imbalance. Many observers believe this environment could have had deeply harmful effects on a developing teenager's emotional well-being. When a victim is repeatedly forced to vocalize the desires of her abuser, to perform the role of a willing, eager, and mature participant in her own exploitation, it creates a terrifying cognitive dissonance. Completely bypassing the simple goal of selling compact discs, he weaponized the grueling repetition of the recording process to fundamentally brainwash her. Every single time she sang those lyrics inside the vocal booth, on a music video set, or under the blinding lights of a live stage, she was being forced to publicly validate the very man who was systematically destroying her childhood. She was made the spokesperson for her own captivity. The sheer, terrifying brilliance of this exploiter strategy lay in its weaponization of the global consumer base. Kelly seamlessly transformed millions of innocent music fans into unwitting accomplices to his crimes. When the album hit the airwaves and climbed the charts, the public did not critically analyze the terrifying asymmetrical power dynamic behind the music. They simply reacted to the undeniable groove of the production and the flawless, angelic delivery of the vocalist. Teenagers across the globe bought the cassette tapes. Radio DJs put the singles on heavy, relentless rotation, and seasoned music critics praised the remarkably mature, sophisticated sound of the young artist. Every unit sold, every chart position climbed, and every concert ticket purchased served as a massive societal reinforcement of Kelly's twisted narrative. The public was effectively singing his alibi back to him at top volume. This widespread enthusiastic acceptance is the ultimate, terrifying goal of a grooming process executed on a macroeconomic scale. By embedding his justification into a highly consumable, culturally dominant product, Kelly successfully normalized his pathology. He made the legally and morally unacceptable sound entirely irresistible. This massive commercial success provided the ultimate impenetrable shield for the ongoing abuse. In the ruthless, highly pragmatic calculus of the 1990s music industry, a platinum certification did not merely represent financial wealth. It represented absolute corporate protection and legal immunity. The album was a financial juggernaut for Jive Records, generating staggering revenue streams. Once that capital began to flow, any lingering moral hesitations or whispered concerns within the corporate hierarchy evaporated instantly. The industry machinery actively mobilized to protect the product, which inherently meant actively protecting the coercive operator who created it. Highly paid publicists were hired to carefully manage and sanitize the narrative. Interviewers and journalists were strictly warned by management teams to steer clear of questioning the specific intimate nature of the producer-protege relationship. An entire sprawling ecosystem of managers, lawyers, and record executives functioned as a heavily armed, highly compensated security detail for a crime scene. The art was deliberately and effectively distorted into a highly lucrative smokescreen. Aaliyah was trapped in an impossible, suffocating paradigm. She was bound not only by the deep psychological chains placed upon her by Kelly, but by a multi-million-dollar corporate apparatus that actively required her continued silent submission to keep the stock prices high and the revenue flowing. The music industry of the 1990s proved definitively that it would gladly tolerate the psychological dismantling and physical consumption of a child, provided the soundtrack to that consumption continued to top the Billboard charts. The album was entirely stripped of its artistic merit the moment it became a tool for survival. For the millions of people listening at home, "Age Ain't Nothing But a Number" was the defining soundtrack of a generation. But for the girl singing the words, it was the heavy iron door of a cell clicking firmly shut. The illusion meticulously crafted inside the Chicago Recording Company was fundamentally fragile because it relied on suppressing the biological reality of a developing adolescent. In the summer of 1994, that reality violently asserted itself. Rumors and physical signs of a potential pregnancy began to emerge. Within the isolated, highly controlled ecosystem R. Kelly had built, a pregnancy was not a medical event or a cause for familial joy. It was a catastrophic legal emergency. It was the ultimate, undeniable biological receipt of illegal statutory coercion. For Kelly, a man who had built a multi-million-dollar empire on absolute control, this development triggered profound panic. Devoid of any genuine concern for the physical or emotional devastation of a 15-year-old girl, his panic stemmed exclusively from absolute self-preservation. He was staring directly at the prospect of a lengthy mandatory state prison sentence. He needed to immediately close the legal vulnerability he had created. To neutralize this massive legal threat, Kelly did not seek counsel or attempt to make amends. He orchestrated a calculated, multi-tiered felony. On August 31st, 1994, A marriage license was procured in Cook County, Illinois. The procurement of this document was a masterclass in systemic corruption and criminal fraud. The certificate explicitly and fraudulently listed Aaliyah's age as 18. This was not a spontaneous romantic elopement driven by youthful passion. It was a cold, strategic legal maneuver. Kelly utilized his immense wealth and localized power to bribe officials and falsify government documents. The objective of this illegal marriage was brutally pragmatic: to secure spousal privilege. Under the American legal system, a spouse cannot be compelled to testify against their partner in a criminal proceeding. By legally binding his 15-year-old victim to him on paper, Kelly believed he could permanently silence her, block any potential grand jury subpoenas, and effectively legally handcuff her family from pursuing criminal charges. He was using the institution of marriage as a highly effective government-sanctioned gag order. The meticulously constructed fortress of secrecy inevitably collapsed when the forged marriage certificate was leaked to the press, culminating in a bombshell publication by Vibe magazine. The physical document bearing the undeniable proof of the illegal union was presented to the global public. At this precise historical moment, the American cultural and legal system faced growing public pressure to examine allegations involving a teenager and a controversial celebrity relationship. Instead, many critics later viewed the reaction as a troubling example of institutional failure. The mainstream media often treated the leaked marriage certificate less as a serious legal controversy and more as sensational tabloid material. Reports about a 27-year-old man allegedly marrying a 15-year-old girl were frequently reduced to late-night jokes and aggressive celebrity coverage, rather than sustained public discussion about the ethical and legal concerns involved. Critics argue that parts of the media contributed to minimizing the seriousness of the controversy by turning a deeply troubling situation into consumable entertainment. A clinical audit of the corporate machinery perfectly highlights the sheer terrifying efficiency of Robert Sylvester Kelly's heavily insulated escape from the 1994 marriage scandal. The narrative frequently isolates Kelly as a lone, devious mastermind, but this is a gross historical inaccuracy. He was the apex exploiter, but he operated within a highly sophisticated, heavily financed ecosystem of corporate enablers. When the forged marriage certificate leaked to Vibe magazine, the crisis did not trigger a moral awakening within Jive Records or his management team. It triggered the immediate deployment of a cleanup protocol. This protocol relied heavily on the music industry's strict code of omertà, a wall of silence purchased through extreme financial leverage. The executives recognized that Kelly's ongoing 12-play tour and subsequent album sales were generating tens of millions of dollars in liquid capital. To protect this revenue stream, a highly coordinated defense matrix was activated. High-powered attorneys were dispatched not to investigate the abuse, but to aggressively draft and enforce non-disclosure agreements, NDAs. These legal documents were weaponized to silence studio engineers, background singers, and low-level staff who had witnessed the grooming process firsthand. Simultaneously, a massive infusion of hush money was allegedly directed toward local Illinois officials and potential witnesses to ensure the illegal statutory coercion investigation completely stalled before a grand jury could be convened. The corporate public relations department executed a masterclass in narrative diversion. They instructed Kelly to publicly deny the marriage entirely, while simultaneously pushing a counter-narrative to sympathetic journalists that framed the scandal as a racist attempt by the media to tear down a successful black artist. The corporate boardrooms of Jive Records did not merely turn a blind eye to the fraudulent marriage, they actively financed the cover-up. Faced with irrefutable evidence that their primary financial asset had committed statutory rape, the executives executed a chilling cost-benefit analysis. They prioritized the staggering sales figures of the 12 Play tour over the safety of a child. The corporation circled the wagons around the systemic abuser, deploying elite legal counsel and public relations crisis teams to enforce non-disclosure agreements and deflect the narrative. In doing so, they completely abandoned Aaliyah. The 15-year-old victim was left entirely alone to absorb the crushing weight of global public scrutiny, fighting not just a 27-year-old abuser, but a multi-billion-dollar syndicate that had mathematically determined her psychological destruction was an acceptable operating cost. The 15-year-old victim was left entirely alone to navigate the immense crushing weight of global public scrutiny, shame, and media harassment. The label that had profited massively from the exploitation of her childhood abruptly severed her as a liability, allowing her to absorb the entirety of the reputational damage while her abuser remained safely insulated within his corporate stronghold. The most terrifying failure during this critical juncture was the absolute silence of the criminal justice system. The forged marriage certificate was a matter of public record. The ages of both individuals were verifiable facts. The commission of underage exploitation and the falsification of government documents were not mere rumors. They were heavily documented realities splashed across international magazines. Yet, no police cruisers arrived at the Chicago recording company. No federal investigators raided R. Kelly's compound. No district attorney stepped forward to file charges on behalf of the state. The case demonstrated the terrifying, impenetrable shield provided by massive wealth and celebrity. Kelly's financial resources allowed him to operate completely above the law, purchasing a level of absolute immunity that rendered the police and the courts entirely impotent. The legal system looked at a documented child coercive operator and essentially shrugged, proving to Kelly that there were absolutely no boundaries he could not cross and no crimes he could not buy his way out of. Examining the clinical, heavily lawyered mechanics of the annulment itself flawlessly deconstructs the aftermath of the forged marriage. The extraction of Aaliyah in February 1995 was not a standard, emotional, familial rescue. It was a high-stakes, ruthless, corporate hostage negotiation. When the Houghton family mobilized to legally void the fraudulent union in Michigan, the legal apparatus surrounding R. Kelly did not surrender unconditionally. Recognizing the catastrophic legal jeopardy their client faced if the 15-year-old victim was permitted to speak freely to law enforcement or the press, Kelly's attorneys executed a brutal defensive maneuver. They mandated the execution of an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, NDA, as a foundational condition of the legal severance. This legal document functioned as a permanent, court-sanctioned gag order. Moving far beyond the silent aftermath of profound psychological trauma, she was explicitly contractually paralyzed. The NDA legally prohibited her and her family from ever publicly discussing the specific parameters of the abuse, the fraudulent marriage, or the coercive environment of the Chicago recording company. If she violated this agreement to warn other young women or to seek public justice, she faced the immediate threat of massive civil litigation that would bankrupt her family and permanently destroy her nascent career. The legal system was successfully weaponized by the coercive operator to ensure that his most high-profile victim was transformed into a silent, legally compliant vault for his crimes. However, the absolute darkest, most incomprehensible layer of this extraction involves the concept of fiduciary duty and familial betrayal. The individual who originally orchestrated the introduction between the 12-year-old prodigy and the 24-year-old producer was Aaliyah's uncle, Barry Hankerson. Hankerson operated as the founder of Blackground Records and the primary manager for R. Kelly. When the disturbing allegations involving a minor and the falsified marriage certificate became public, many people believed that family members and industry figures should have immediately cut ties with him and focused on protecting the teenager involved. However, critics of the 1990s music industry argue that the business realities of the era often produced a very different response. Barry Hankerson did not end his professional relationship with R. Kelly in 1994. As Kelly continued generating enormous touring revenue and publishing profits, Hankerson was accused by observers of prioritizing business interests over the emotional well-being and protection of his niece. He continued to manage, promote, and financially benefit from one of the industry's most controversial figures, despite the growing public scandal surrounding the case. This staggering familial betrayal stripped Aaliyah of her ultimate safety net. It proved to her at the age of 15 that in the ruthless industrialized ecosystem of R&B music, biological bloodlines offered absolutely zero protection against the gravitational pull of extreme capital. She was forced to navigate the remainder of her life carrying the agonizing realization that her abuser's career was actively being subsidized and managed by the very uncle who was supposed to protect her. The annulment severed the fraudulent marriage, but the financial architecture that enabled the abuse remained entirely, terrifyingly intact. Her survival demanded a radical, immediate reinvention. Relocating to Atlantic Records, Aaliyah forged a new definitive creative alliance that would entirely rewrite the trajectory of modern R&B. She entered the studio with a relatively unknown production duo, Timbaland and Missy Elliott. This collaboration was the absolute antithesis of the dictatorial systemic abuser environment she had just escaped. For the first time in her professional life, she was not operating under the absolute authority of an older male figure who viewed her as property. The introduction of Missy Elliott into her creative circle was particularly vital. Elliott provided a fiercely protective female perspective, offering a sanctuary of sisterhood within a deeply patriarchal industry. Timbaland did not demand total psychological submission to create a beat. He offered a collaborative, futuristic sonic landscape where Aaliyah was treated as an equal, visionary partner. The resulting sophomore album, One in a Million, released in 1996, was a profound act of reclamation. It was not just a shift in musical direction, it was the sound of a young woman aggressively taking back ownership of her voice, her image, and her bodily autonomy. She systematically dismantled the visual prison Kelly had constructed. She shed the heavy oversized denim and the dark sunglasses, stepping into the light with a sleek, futuristic, and highly self-directed visual identity. She was no longer hiding from the world or shielding herself from the exploiter gaze of her former mentor. She dictated exactly how her image would be consumed. The music itself was complex, syncopated, and entirely devoid of the disturbing age-inappropriate sexual coercion that defined her debut. She utilized her immense talent to build an impenetrable artistic fortress, establishing herself as an independent cultural icon and permanently leaving the shadow of her abuser in the dust. Yet, while Aaliyah successfully navigated her trauma and ascended to unprecedented heights in both music and film before her devastatingly premature death in 2001, the dark reality she left behind metastasized into a sprawling industrial nightmare. The societal and legal failure of 1994 birthed a monster of unprecedented proportions. When R. Kelly watched the media turn his illegal statutory coercion into a tabloid joke, and when he saw Jive Records hand him a massive new recording budget instead of a contract termination, he absorbed a terrifying permanent lesson. The system had explicitly informed him that his wealth, his celebrity, and his ability to write hit songs made him completely invincible. The lack of punishment was interpreted as a total, unconditional license to hunt. Armed with this terrifying confirmation, Kelly took the exact blueprint he had successfully beta tested on a 14-year-old Aaliyah and weaponized it on a macroeconomic scale. He recognized that the isolated recording studio, the promise of musical mentorship, and the deployment of NDAs formed a flawless, impenetrable trap. Over the next 2 decades, he did not just commit isolated acts of abuse. He built a highly coordinated, heavily financed infrastructure designed specifically for the procurement, isolation, and psychological destruction of young women and girls. He utilized his international touring schedule, his massive entourage, and his corporate backing to identify vulnerable targets, lure them into his heavily fortified compounds in Chicago and Atlanta, and subject them to unimaginable levels of coercive control and ever-physical coercion. Every single victim who fell into Robert Sylvester Kelly's sprawling network between 1995 and his eventual arrest in 2019 represents a direct catastrophic consequence of the music industry's cowardice in 1994. If the record executives, the media, and the criminal justice system had possessed the basic moral fortitude to intervene when the forged marriage certificate was published, a 20-year reign of terror would have been entirely prevented. Dozens of lives would have been spared from total psychological annihilation. The corporate decision to prioritize the sales of compact discs over the safety of a child financed a multi-generational systemic abuser, proving that a system built on unregulated greed will always protect the abuser at the expense of the vulnerable. The legacy of the 1990s superproducer era stands as a brutal indictment of capitalist entertainment. It forces a harrowing reevaluation of the pop culture we consume and the idols we manufacture. The recording studio, long romanticized as a sanctuary of creative genius, was successfully utilized as an unregulated black site for human exploitation. When the raw ambition of youth is commodified by men possessing absolute unchecked authority, art is stripped of its beauty and transformed into a weapon of mass psychological destruction. We are left with a permanent, blood-stained warning regarding the blinding power of fame and capital. The tragedy demands absolute vigilance against systems that demand silence in exchange for success. It requires us to recognize that the most dangerous exploiter do not operate in the shadows. They operate under the brightest stadium lights, shielded by platinum records, corporate lawyers, and the deafening, complicit applause of a society that refused to look at the truth.